friend Shannon here, your confirmation director. Today we are learning about confirmation session 5, Israel, God's chosen people. We have Rabbi Jonathan here, and he serves in our community as a rabbi and a chaplain. He serves the Jewish community and Jewish family services. So we're going to turn over our time to him, so be sure to pay close attention as he talks about Judaism and Christianity and what our two faiths hold in common.
I would say Judaism, more than anything else, is a way of life. I would say that more than a religion, although it depends what religion means to you. And I would say that from this perspective of being a way of life, okay, some homework I'm going to give. If you haven't, especially if you're not familiar with Judaism, if you haven't seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, all right, definitely do that. I'm not sure what streaming avenue it's available on, but I know it is. And that's a great background for what Judaism is and what it means to be Jewish. But I'll also put this out there. In the Hebrew scriptures, in the Torah, Jewish people are known by 3 different names. First, Hebrews. Second, Israelites. And third, Jews. Hebrews has to do, literally means those who pass over or pass through or cross over. And literally, in terms of the story, they're river crossers. So they're people who kind of move from here to there. And that has a lot to do with the experience of Jewish history over time. And it also ends up meaning that Jewish people and the Jewish people end up being good bridges from different communities and different geographies and different places and peoples. The second one is Israelites, which goes back to this amazing kind of all-night wrestling story, also in the book of Genesis, where Jacob begins and ends up as Israel. And that transition of Jacob to Israel and then everyone after him as the children of Israel, that has to do really with grapplers, with strugglers, people who kind of wrestle with God and wrestle with other people to learn more about themselves and what God wants from us in the world. And then the third is the word Jews, which only comes up at the end of the whole Hebrew scriptures, for example, in the book of Esther, where Mordecai is called Mordecai the Jew. And literally, the word Jew means thanks. So it has to do with giving thanks and gratitude. And then the last thing I'm going to say in terms of a nutshell view about Judaism is something that I learned from a Jewish scholar of the New Testament, Amy Jill Levine, who teaches at Vanderbilt. And she put it this way when she's comparing Judaism and Christianity. She put it into a sports metaphor. She said, whereas Christianity is like football, where you're trying to get from one end of the field to the other end of the field, and the other end of the field, the other end zone, is salvation, and you're trying to get there. She said, Judaism is akin to baseball, where it's all about coming home and getting home. So that's another way to look in a nutshell at Judaism. We share what is often known in the Christian tradition and the Christian community as the Old Testament, what we call the Torah, right? We share that. So as holy scriptures, in terms of God teaching us, showing us through those scriptures, that's a big deal of having in common those scriptures. The second, I'd say, point of commonality, which is really important, which may sound a little crazier, is Jesus. And, I'm someone, and most Jews don't grow up talking a lot about Jesus, right? But the rabbi I grew up with here in Kansas City would teach about Jesus as someone who he taught this way. He said, what Jesus has to teach Jewish people is at a time which is not so dissimilar than now, at a time when status in the Jewish community was determined by wealth and or by education, by Torah learning, right? Jesus was asking the question, what if you don't have either of those? What about those people, right? Maybe they didn't have the opportunities. Right? So do we just not, do we not relate with those people? Do we not associate with those people? So, and I think for Christians, Jesus is coming out, obviously, especially in a context like this, of a Jewish environment, of a Jewish atmosphere. And so we share that a lot. The chapter that you're relating to, chapter 12, is known in Hebrew and in Jewish language as the Torah portion of Lech Lecha, which literally means kind of get up and go, or get yourself going. Right? So in Lech Lecha is where kind of Abraham and Sarah are told to get up and start out on this journey. So this is huge, right? Because this is what kind of starts to be the foundation of how Judaism becomes a religion. Because Judaism is, which is a bit different than Christianity in this sense, Judaism is this kind of inseparable and not able to untangle parallel connections or intertwined connections between faith and family. So it's a family of people. It's Abraham and Sarah, right? And so in that case, that's kind of where the Jewish story begins. Whereas before chapter 12, no one thinks that those people who are mentioned before were Jewish. They were kind of, let's say, universal people. And then we get to this, okay, this is where the Jewish story begins, which is why it's a really good challenge to Jewish people. And I often ask Jewish people, right, why do you think the Torah didn't start in chapter 12? Right? Because it didn't. Right? It could have, but it started in chapter 1. So what's all that about? And why is that important to Jewish people? And that's the universal and the particular, and how we have to hold on to both of those. But the last thing I want to say about this story, which gets to the heart of being Hebrews, right? Because the language that we speak, Hebrew, is, we're not called Hebrews because that's the language. The language is called Hebrew because we're the Hebrews, right? And so the Hebrews means those who cross over, and this directly relates back to this journey that they start on in chapter 12, heading to this place that I'll show you. And so if you look closely at the Hebrew literally means go to you. So it's got this kind of, that comes up later in Luke, for example, this whole idea of self-examination, how in the course of one's life one needs to understand themselves. We're tempted to look at other people and tell them what they're doing, right or wrong, as the case may be a lot of the times. And yet we're pulled back to say, let us first look at ourselves. Right? So the parallel in the Torah is to say, I'm going to send you on this journey to this land, right? But part of the process of that journey is learning about yourself. There's a lot of ambivalence about being the chosen people. I think kind of at the very best that it can mean is being an example, right? And really the example goes back to that Judaism is much more a religion of deed than of creed. So prime importance is placed on what you do and how you live. And inside of that, taking care of those who are less fortunate, right, is what's mentioned more times than anything else in the Torah, is that you need to take care of people who are less fortunate. For example, the orphan, the widow, and the stranger, right? And then oftentimes it's underlined in many of the places where that's said in the Torah, because you know what it's like, because you were strangers in a strange land. So I think that's one of the reasons why Jewish people tend to, not all of them, but tend to get involved where there is injustice in the world. Not just because it's kind of in some general amorphous way the right thing to do, but it's because that's what we are kind of instructed, commanded, guided to do. And I guess in that sense you could say we're chosen to be those kind of frontline advocates on behalf of justice, to bring justice into the world, and really to bring God into the world. But it's a complicated thing, especially for young people, but for many adults too. In terms of how do we be a blessing in the world, right? Back to that story, back to the famous chapter 12, right, the Lech Lecha, says, and you shall be a blessing. And one of the most famous commentators on the Torah from the medieval times, who's known as Rashi, says kind of, what does that mean to be a blessing? What does that mean you shall be a blessing, right? And one of the meanings that's made out of that is that up until now, right, the power to bless was in the hands of God. And so to say you shall be a blessing is a way of saying now I'm putting that power in your hands. As human beings, you can bless other people, okay? So now the question is, what does it mean? So first of all, I think when you say, how can we? I think one of the things is we bless another person. So kind of one-on-one, concrete, specific focus on kind of where you are, the people who are around you, the people who are a little bit further, you know, if you kind of take the greater Kansas City area, right? There's so much opportunity to be blessing, right? A challenge in that also is, and I'm a chaplain, right? So when you talk about pastoral care, right? Sometimes pastoral care is being prophetic. Sometimes it's confronting, it's saying what is not popular, right? But needs to be said. There's a famous John Mayer song, and I'm probably dating myself a little bit, but John Mayer has this song, Say What You Need to Say, right? So it's a song in some ways about prophecy, about saying what needs to be said, right? So the word blessing in Hebrew, which is bracha, right, has this kind of horticultural element to it. And a lot of Hebrew does, because it's grounded in the land of Israel and a lot in the context of agriculture. And a lot of the holidays are as well. So what it actually means is, in that context of horticulture, is to take a branch of a tree, to bend it over into the ground, which it wouldn't grow that way naturally, and then have it go into the dirt. It then becomes a root, and a tree grows out of that branch. So there's something about that dynamic which is, first of all, uncomfortable, kind of can be cross-grained in terms of taking the branch and bending it over, right? And I forgot what the term is in English for this, but there's a term in English. But it's the same root as the word blessing in Hebrew. And then a new tree comes. So in that process, then when we bless somebody, good can ultimately come out, even where there's discomfort and where it would be easier to not look over there or to stay quiet, right? As Dr. King said, right, that it was much less hurtful were the words of my enemies than the silence of my friends. Right? So part of being a blessing is saying what needs to be said and standing up and standing with. So this blessing, the priestly blessing, goes in three parts. So I'm going to say it in English first, and then I'll invoke the blessing in Hebrew. So it asks that God would bless you and keep you, meaning watch over and protect you. That God would lift up God's countenance, God's face towards you and be gracious to you and always grant you grace. And that God would shine God's countenance on you and grant you the blessing of peace and wholeness, which is shalom. Right? And it goes like this. Yevarechechem Adonai v'yishmerechem. Ya'er Adonai panav elechem v'yichunekem. Yisa Adonai panav elechem v'yasem lachem shalom. So I would like you each and all to know that you would be welcome in any of the congregations in town. There are 12 different congregations that span the denominational spectrum of Jewish life. And maybe even, some of you will go to different ones and you can compare and contrast experiences. But like you all at the Church of the Resurrection, many of us are limited in terms of in-person worship services, and much is happening online. So in with the blessing and the curse of that, the blessing part is it's easier and more accessible to be able to visit those worship services in different congregations. So I invite you to take advantage of that, to take the opportunity to come, not just to be there to observe and to learn for yourselves, but also that gives an opportunity for us in the Jewish community to practice hospitality, and that's not uncommon for congregations in town to have people who visit, and people enjoy that fellowship and those connections. So consider yourselves invited.